Hi, I'm Kuljit Bhamra, and in this episode of Demystifying Indian Music, we'll be looking at the question, what is a raga? For the purpose of this program, I'm going to simplify the definition of raga so that it's easy to understand. Ragas are associated with times of day, they're associated with spiritualism, vibration, and many other things, traditionally. But for the sake of this program, I'm going to disassociate those from the actual musical form and structure of what a raga is. Is it raga or is it rag? Actually, they're both correct. Let me explain. In India, the music is divided into two categories geographically: North Indian classical music and South Indian classical music. And in the south of India, Sanskrit still plays a very strong part in terminology and music. And Sanskrit is a language which in many of the words end in a or So if you hear a word that ends in a or most likely it's a South Indian word. People know of the Indian dance form Bharatanatyam, which is a South Indian word. So you can, as a rule of thumb, you can really use that to try and locate where the music or the art form is from. Similarly, in the north of India, you would have Lord Ram. In south of India, Lord Rama. The demon god would be known as Ravan in the north, Ravana in the south, and so on. So therefore, in the north, a lot of people call the raga a rag, and in the south, many people refer to rag as raga. I'll do my best to avoid using jargon and musical terminology in this explanation, but it's unavoidable, so I will be using some musical terms which will help you if you're a musician, but probably won't if you're not. Okay, so let's look at what a raga is in terms of musical terminology and in terms of music itself. I would describe a raga as a scale which carries an emotional content. Okay, now what does that mean? Let's first look at the word scale. Now, I would describe scale as a series of notes or a prescribed set of notes. But while you're doing that, what we're saying is that there's an emotional, a feeling or there's a certain emotion attached to that particular scale. Many of you are aware of a major chord being happy or a minor chord being melancholic or sad. Well, if you took that thinking a bit further, you could also understand how a set of notes could carry a feeling or a mood. Now, in the Western music culture, we have something called modes. And a mode really is a scale that carries a mood. I'm not sure if the word mode came from mood, but anyway, let's forget about that for a moment. And we would say in the West, okay, that song or that piece carries a sort of Lydian feeling to it, or it might have a Dorian emotion to it. Similarly, in India and in the world of ragas, what we say is, if you were to play these series of notes, it would feel like this. It would have a feeling of perhaps the rainy season, or it may have a feeling of morning or evening. It may even have a feeling of loss or joy or celebration or melancholy, etc., etc. Technically speaking, you could say that the difference between a raga and a Western mode is that Western modes are used for compositional purposes, whereas ragas are used for improvisational purposes. So if you were a performer or a musician in India and you were performing a raga recital, you would select your scale or your raga. Many of the ragas have names. And then within the limitations or constraints of that scale and that note, you would express yourself and you would improvise. You would dance around the notes and play with the notes and play with your fellow musician who's on stage with you and explore the whole world of that raga. One of the myths about Indian raga recital and performance is that Indian musicians are completely free and in the moment and are completely have all the musical notes at their discretion and they can play whatever they want. That's not actually correct. In a raga recital, there are constraints. There are notes that you can play. There are notes that you can't play. There's a particular note that maybe has a dominant character in the whole piece, so you need to sort of spend a lot of time playing that note. There may be another note that has a sort of semi-dominant purpose in the whole piece. And then there may be a characteristic phrase of that particular raga. So you've got the actual selection of notes that you can play, you can't play. There are certain notes you can emphasize and you can't emphasize. And then there's a characteristic signature phrase that you need to keep coming back to. Now, if you think about that, that's not really free. That's quite a strict context within which to work. But here's a magical thing. When you have a constraint imposed on you like that musically, it somehow gives your freedom expression more scope. If I was to give you a blank piece of paper and say to you, draw a picture, and you can draw anything you want, many of us would sit there pulling our hair out thinking, oh, I don't know where to start. But if I was to give you a blank piece of paper and then 3 pens of different colours, and then I said to you, you can only use straight lines or curves, you really would think about how you're going to use those components and those rules. And in a way, it's more freeing when you do that. Okay, so what does a raga performance look like? Well, typically, you'd have 2 musicians on stage, 2 soloists. One would be a melodic instrumentalist, maybe a sitarist, perhaps a flautist, maybe a singer, maybe a violinist. And then you'd have a percussionist, maybe a tabla player, maybe a mridangam player, mridangam from the south of India. And there would be an interplay between the 2 virtuosos. Many times there is a drone being performed as well, and the drone is usually performed on a tanpura, which is a drone instrument, and so sometimes is the 3rd person on stage. Nowadays, many performers like to have an electronic tanpura drone, which means that the 3rd person is not there on stage. But the 2 musicians, they are interacting in a way. They're playing within the constraints of the raga, within the constraints of the rhythmical cycle. And by the way, once the rhythmical cycle is set up, it stays fixed for the raga. We'll talk about tala and rhythms in another episode. So within those rules and regulations of a rhythmic cycle, a set of notes, a way to play those notes, certain notes to focus on, certain notes not to focus on, we have a whole raga performance available to us at our fingertips. And the performers generally would explore the raga in 3 or 4 movements, or chapters you could call them. Usually the first movement would be the soloist instrumentalist slowly unfolding the notes of the raga and introducing them to us. Sometimes that can take half an hour or an hour. Then there'll be a time when it becomes more rhythmical and a bit more passionate perhaps. And then after that, the tabla player would join in, and then it would become a frenzied interaction and interplay between the 2 musicians and end with something called a tihai. Again, there's another episode exploring what a tihai is. So that's what a raga performance would look like in terms of structure and appearance. I'd like to spend a few moments looking at some of the concerns and issues that I have about raga recital in the West. I've seen concerts and recitals where a lot of the time is spent trying to wow audiences and mesmerize them and impress them with technical prowess and speed. And for me, sometimes the music gets lost. As a tabla player, I have a personal gripe that I'd like to share with you, and that is, in the Indian subcontinent, tabla players are frequently looked upon as accompanists. And so it's quite common to see a poster for a concert in which the soloist's name is in big letters, and sometimes the tabla player's name is unmentioned. Yet the tabla player has undergone the same rigour in tuition and learning that the melodic soloist has undergone, yet somehow tabla players are considered 10 to the dozen and sort of not important. I don't know, some people say there is a caste thing going on, that tabla players touch skin and therefore they're low caste. I don't know what the reason is, but nevertheless, I think it's important to honour all musicians equally. As a result of being an accompanist, tablas, when given their moment to show their light, really try and cram everything into that 5 or 10 minutes that the soloist gives them. And that creates a sort of pressure cooker of creativity, which I don't think really serves the music well. Also, because of the way that Indian classical music is taught, and the emphasis is really on creating virtuosi rather than ensemble musicians, and also I believe that there isn't a lot of room for many soloists in the world. In fact, if you think about all the musicians in the world, I don't know what percentage of them would be soloists, but I think it'd be very, very small. Most musicians like to play in an ensemble, or they like to play popular music. But if you think about Indian music and the way it's taught and the emphasis on being a soloist, it's quite competitive. People are taught in schools or gharanas, and the gharanas compete. Now, they don't compete overtly, but there is an underlying competitiveness that I have discovered. Again, that may not be a bad thing, because competition is healthy generally. But then I feel that some musicians try to prove that they're better than others. Some schools are better than others. Some gurus are better than others. Some gharanas are better than others. And in my own experience, I've been to many Indian classical concerts in India and in the UK. And when I come out of the concert hall after an amazing performance, I hear the audiences talk to themselves, and many of them say, oh, he's not that good, he's better than him, no, that's better than him. And a lot of the discussions are about who's better than who. And really, I'd love to see people saying, I love that concert because it made me cry, or it moved me, or it made me laugh. And I think one of the reasons that that's not taking place is because there's a lack of repertoire. People are playing ragas, and there are many ways of playing different ragas. But there's no repertoire. People that actually compose are the players themselves. So for example, if you went to see a sitar recital, the sitarist is actually the composer on the spot. And in that case, there's no need to write down any music because no one else is going to play it in that way. And so therefore, it becomes very competitive because people try to prove that they can express a particular raga better than other people. I think that's a problem, and I think it's one of the issues of actually juxtaposing Indian classical music into a Western environment. Another feature of this East meets West dilemma, as I call it, is that many musicians come to impress and wow us with their speed and entertain audiences in the West. And I think the Western audiences are still buying that. For me, that's not a bad thing, except that the raga, the purpose of the raga and the beauty of the raga sometimes gets lost. I've seen musicians that, for example, people that make the sound of a running deer, or the sound of a train, which is entertaining again, but I still think sometimes we miss the point. Another thing also is that sometimes I feel us Indian musicians can get away with murder on stage. And what I mean by that is sometimes the mysticism and the magic connected with the foreign instruments that we play entices audiences to really, it somehow blinds them in a way. And I've seen musicians, for example, on stage, you may have a vocalist that suddenly, is doing a passage or scatting like a jazz singer and saying something like "Sariga, sariga, sarigama," and everyone will clap because he's holding his breath. You'd never get an English musician going "Do-re-mi, do-re-mi, do-re-mi-fa." Unlikely that you get a round of applause for that. And also, you wouldn't get a jazz drummer on stage coming up to the microphone and saying "Ba-doom dam doom dam ba-doom dam doom," and then playing "Ba-doom dam doom dam ba-doom dam doom." But a tabla player could walk on stage and say "Da din da da din da da din da da," and we get away with it. So for me, I feel that's slightly unacceptable, and I feel that somehow this dynamic of East meets West keeps those sort of gimmicks alive. And again, I think the reason I'm saying this is because my passion for the Raga recital and for classical music and for Indian music in general is so strong, it pinches me when I see it diluted in that way.